Last week I sent out a request on Instagram for people to send me questions. My thinking was that I would occasionally do a little bit of a Q&A with these video things. And much to my surprise, I got about 350 odd questions, and I was totally blown away. Some of them were silly and some of them were political, which I won't talk about those, but most of them were really interesting and thoughtful questions about making records, the philosophy about making records, and the music business in general. And one of the first ones I wanted to talk about was this one that came through, or a variation of this one. There was a lot of overlap with questions, and sometimes they were similar, so I would truncate them into one. This one came in, and I thought it was interesting, so I wanted to talk about it. It is: would you discuss your view on limitations, the advantages and disadvantages of having limitations? At first, I was a bit reticent to talk about this because I felt like limitations are often talked about in recording, in articles, especially if you read something like Tape Op. It seems like every other article somebody's extolling the virtues of their old 4-track machine because it has limitations and they're more creative to work around, etc. I don't know if I totally buy that, but I'll give it the benefit of the doubt. I will say at the outset that I tend to be a little cynical with the conversation about limitations because I think a lot of it, at the root of a lot of the talk of limitations, is this kind of, we have this tendency to fetishize old recording technology and to romanticize these limitations as some sort of magic virtue. And I think oftentimes that fetishizing of technology becomes a bit of a fashion statement for people. It becomes a bit of a badge of honor or like a membership card in the sort of cool credibility club. And as much as I love Tape Op as a magazine, I see it a lot in there. I see it a lot on Gearspace or other forums where people talk about using their old 4-tracks or their old 1-inch 16-track because, not just because of the way it sounds, but because the limitations make them work more creatively. And I don't doubt that there's some truth in that for some people, but I can't help but be cynical about that in general because I think that limitations, like anything, have a context, and that context is entirely dependent on the artist using them. So when I hear arguments like the Beatles wouldn't have made good records without limitations, or Talk Talk wouldn't have made Spirit of Eden without the limitations they had, I just find that stuff sort of silly because these were true artists that were going to make a statement of art regardless of whatever limitations were in front of them, or lack of limitations for that matter. So I remain unconvinced by that argument. That being said, I think that limitations do have advantages and disadvantages that are rather objective and not necessarily dependent on context. I think about when I was a young engineer. I started when I was like 16 or 17 as an assistant engineer. And when I was younger, we were working mainly on 24-track 2-inch and 16-track 2-inch and mixing to half-inch, working on a desk, limited outboard gear, hardware reverbs, etc. And I learned a lot about how to make those limitations work and how to work creatively around problem solving and working within the limitations of the format and the technology at the time. And as a younger engineer, when I look back now, that was a very important way for me to kind of build a library of techniques and processes that I refer to constantly now. And I may not have had such an easy time, or rather, it may have been much more difficult for me to build that library of ideas and techniques and processes had I not had the limitations that I had with the medium. So I think for younger engineers, limitations like that are important, and they can provide a valuable method into creative problem solving in the studio. and into developing new techniques to attain a sound you're going for, or working outside of the box in unconventional ways. I think those limitations, in the context of being a young sort of learning engineer and producer, can be very helpful. I imagine that if I was 20 making records with the lack of limitations that I have now, I probably would have gotten quite lost in it. And I see that a lot now. I hear that a lot in records where people have just had no ability to make a decision because they don't have the limitation to make a decision. And they're not imposing limitations on themselves, so therefore they get sort of lost in the technology and lost in the options, and what I would call option paralysis. Now, that all being said, as I've gotten older and worked on far, far more records and developed more of a language of working on records, I find the distinct lack of limitation to be a tremendous value creatively to me, because I can work in any way I see fit at any given time. And I also am given the choice to impose limitations on myself. So for instance, I can choose to make a record with only this type of microphone, or I can choose to only use certain technologies if I want to make a record sound a certain way. But those are self-imposed limitations, not externally imposed. And I think at this point in my career, I don't really want to work with those limitations anymore. I remember on tape, I would always have to be conscious of where the bass was, and it would never come back sounding the same, so it was always a bit of a moving goalpost. And now it's not a moving goalpost. I know exactly what I'm putting in is going to be exactly what I hear when I play back now or 10 years from now. And I find that stuff to be incredibly powerful. The truth is that even with the lack of limitations in current modern digital recording technology, we sort of self-impose limitations all the time. For instance, if I'm using an old hardware compressor, like an optical compressor, it does one thing really, really well. It's not a Swiss Army knife. And I tend to pick equipment or instruments that do one thing really, really well. And so if I want a very compact sounding dark guitar part, I'm not going to play one of my Jazzmasters. I'm going to play potentially a hollow body or something with flat wounds on it. I'm going to pick a different tool for the job because of the limitations of the tools in front of me. And that's a choice of mine that I prefer to have, because then I know exactly what I have with each tool that I'm using, and I think that's important for creative output. I would also say that in general, even though I have well over 150 or so plugins, I pretty much only use a handful of them in any given mix session. So I might have 15 different, 20 different channel strips, but I'm pretty much only using one or two of them. Many instances of them, but one or two of them per session. Even though I have this just seemingly unending list of plugins to choose from, and artist deals with a bunch of different plugin companies, I'm really only using a handful of them at any given time. That's not necessarily a conscious limitation, but it's a limitation that I'm imposing on myself in one way or the other, conscious or not, that's informing the thing I'm working toward. And so I think limitations obviously have their value and their virtue. It's when they become dogma that they're problematic. And so if somebody's using, let's say, an old vintage technology simply because of the limitations it presents, and they think that that limitation gets them to their end creative goal better, but that becomes a dogma, I think that that's something that needs to be sort of dismantled and really investigated. Because you start to hear the technology at a certain point. You know, if somebody's using tape machines as a means to an end, it becomes this thing where you hear the record and you start to hear the technology working rather than the creative expression of the people involved in making the record. You're actually hearing the tape machine instead of the players. Just like if somebody gets a brand new digital toy that has all these options on it, oftentimes they'll use them all at once, and then you're hearing the technology and not the expression. And I think the same holds true for any technology, whether it's a wire recorder from the 30s or a little portable tape recorder from the 60s, or a modern Pro Tool system. Once that dogma becomes the thing that drives you, your creative output always sounds like your dogma. And so in that case, I would suggest looking at the limitations that you're imposing and really investigating whether or not they get you closer to a more rewarding creative output, or if they're actually getting in the way of you being creative in a way that's truest to the art that you're making. The one last thing I'll say about limitations that I think is really important, to me the most important thing in the studio at all times is getting out of the way of an artist's performance. So anything that imposes itself on the artist's performance in a way that's not helpful needs to be gotten rid of. And 30 years ago, when I would have to concern myself with aligning and biasing a tape machine, and then winding the tape onto the heads, and then finding the spot on the tape, and then making sure I'm armed on an open track, and then making sure that if something comes in on the bridge on that track, I'm out of record by then. All of those various things that stand in between the person in the room playing and the recorded playback, all those things that stand in the way are potentially problematic. So when I look at modern technology and its lack of limitations in that regard, I think it's incredibly powerful and important that at any given point I can press record and have the artist performing in the room being recorded. I don't have to think about what track it's on. I don't have to think about where I am on the reel of tape. I can literally just hit record and capture it. And I have access to that. As long as I keep that file, I have access to that performance forever. And that's something that didn't quite easily exist 30 years ago, and I think that's incredibly important. And related to that, I think about like if you're doing 16 or 17 vocal tracks on a song and you're trying to make a composite vocal, sometimes you want to go back to that very first take because inevitably that has a lot of the magic, the innocence of the performance, the improvisation of a first take, the character and the fun of a first take. And there's a high degree of likelihood that you still have that first take using modern digital technology, whereas there was potentially a high likelihood that you didn't have that first take using tape or an older technology because you had the limitations of track count. So maybe just to make space, you had to get rid of those early vocal takes, and then it's no longer there. It's gone forever. And that's the sort of stuff that I think they're sort of small, and you might think of them as trivial little things, but ultimately at the end of the day, when we're in the studio, what we're essentially doing is collecting performances, and limitations can sometimes get in the way and get in between the performance and the recording, and that's something I just never want to happen. It's the utterly the most important thing that I concern myself with on an every day and every moment of every day is that there's nothing in between the person playing and capturing it. And so from that perspective, the lack of limitations is incredibly valuable. Ultimately, though, I think, again, I go back to the idea that limitations have inherent advantages and disadvantages, and ultimately it's up to you as an artist to use them to your best effort and to be sure that those limitations or lack of limitations are helping you toward a creative place that's most pure and true for you. I think that's the most important thing. So hopefully that's helpful and insightful.